John Bolton, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Glad to be with you.
You were President George W. Bush's Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Affairs in the lead up to the Iraq War. And you were one of the strongest advocates for the invasion of Iraq, saying, quote, "We are confident that Saddam Hussein has hidden weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, in Iraq." But intelligence, even at the time, didn't fully support that statement. Throughout 2002, there were many dissenting views within the U.S. intelligence community and from the United Nations around these claims of WMDs in Iraq. In fact, in September 2002, about 2 months before you made that statement, the Defense Intelligence Agency issued a report that included a line clearly stating that they had, quote, "no reliable information on whether Iraq is producing and stockpiling the chemical weapons." But ultimately, these warnings weren't persuasive, or they didn't seem to matter. Why were you determined to invade Iraq?
Well, the information on chemical weapons here is very important. After the first Gulf War, under the terms of Resolution 687 by the Security Council, the ceasefire resolution, Iraq was required to declare all of its stocks of weapons and materials related to nuclear, chemical, and biological weaponry. And in fact, Saddam Hussein declared very extensive stocks of chemical weapons and related materials. Under the terms of 687, Saddam Hussein was required to destroy everything that was declared. So UN weapons inspectors went to Saddam and said, okay, we're here to help destroy your chemical weapons. And the Iraqis said, well, we've already destroyed our chemical weapons. The UN inspectors then said, okay, fine, show us the records that reflect that destruction. Take us to the places where you destroyed the chemical weapons. Let us interview the scientists and technicians who oversaw the destruction of chemical weapons. And the Iraqis refused. Now, this, they rocked and rolled on this for several years. The Iraqi government would never acknowledge that what exactly it had done with the chemical weapons, other than repeated assertions they'd been destroyed. And I will tell you, contrary to what you said at the beginning, I don't know of anyone before the war who didn't believe that Saddam had chemical weapons, including his highest military authorities. Now, it turned out after the war that he didn't, and at least that we could find. In this country, the Rob Silberman Commission concluded in a study after the war, the mistake we had made was believing that Saddam had told the truth when he made declarations in 1991 and 1992 about his chemical weapon stocks. He probably was lying about them then.
It's still somewhat shocking to me that you would take the word of Saddam Hussein over the evidence provided by international inspectors, large parts of the intelligence community, as well as some of your own allies. I mean, for example, UN weapons inspectors worked in Iraq from November 27, 2002 until March 18, 2003. During that time, inspectors from the IAEA and the UN Monitoring, Verification, and Inspections Commission conducted more than 900 inspections at more than 500 sites. The inspectors did not find that Iraq possessed chemical weapons, biological weapons, or that it had reconstituted its nuclear weapons program. That, to me, is somewhat compelling evidence, right? I mean, I could give you more, but if
what you've just said, what you've just said refers to the UN inspections after the Second War. I'm talking about the UN's effort after the First War to verify that Saddam Hussein had destroyed the chemical weapons that he claimed he had. You should do the research, and if you can find anybody in the period 1998, 1999.
But why would that be? Why would that be?
Not have chemical weapons.
I'm confused, Mr. Bolton.
Let's hear.
If you're saying that before going into the war in 2003, there was countervailing evidence, why would it matter whether or not there was evidence in 1998? The point is, before going into war,
there was no countervailing evidence. Nobody could verify what stocks he had or didn't have. But we do know from interviews after the war of Iraqi generals that something like this. Did you have chemical weapons? And the Iraqi general would say, well, I didn't have chemical weapons, but General X over in the Western sector had them. So we'd go to interview General X. And he'd say, no, I didn't have chemical weapons, but General Y, commander of the reserves back in Baghdad, had chemical weapons. The lie that Saddam told began back in 1991 and 1992, but I challenge you again. You find anybody responsible who asserted that Saddam did not have chemical weapons before the war. There weren't
any. Inspectors said there were no chemical weapons. The inspectors did not find that Iraq possessed chemical or biological weapons. Also,
they were blocked in their efforts to
and they also asked for more. And they also asked for more.
Look, I'm just telling you what the UN said. You can believe the UN or not believe the UN.
Well, I'm quoting evidence of the inspectors who very clearly said that weapons of mass destruction, there was no evidence, of chemical or biological weapons, and asking for more time. Also, Hans Blix, former head of UN Monitoring Verification Inspection Commission for Iraq, wrote in an op-ed later in 2013, he said, on February 11th, less than 5 weeks before the invasion, I told U.S. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice I wasn't terribly impressed by the intelligence we had received from the U.S. and that there had been no weapons of mass destruction at any of the sites we had been recommended by American forces. Her response that it was Iraq, not the intelligence, that was on trial here. So there were credible, what you would say, call serious people who certainly at the very least said, hey, we need more time. There is insufficient evidence.
Hans Blix said repeatedly, he told the Iraqi authorities, look, this stuff isn't marmalade. That was the phrase he used referring to the chemical weapons. If you've destroyed them, you have records. We want to see the records. They never produced the records. And the inference that everybody drew was that they still had chemical weapons.
We'll have to disagree. Well, I think the international community and all the people you're alluding to do not say that the inference was that they weren't there. They very clearly said, we don't have any evidence of it. And they certainly didn't push for war. But we can agree to disagree. But let's keep going. President Bush's former head of counterterrorism, Richard Clarke, recounts that the day after 9/11, he and his team told President George W. Bush and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld that, quote, Iraq had nothing to do with this. But that didn't seem to make much difference. He also added, while the World Trade Center was still smoldering, while they were still digging bodies out, people in the White House were thinking, this gives us the opportunity we've been looking for to go after Iraq. This is President Bush's head of counterterrorism. My question is,
he inherited him from the Clinton, from the Clinton administration. He has very high opinion of himself. And I think that's what's reflected in what you're reading.
Again, Bush's head of counterterrorism was ignored.
No, he wasn't ignored. It's simply not true. I mean, he's simply wrong on that. As I say, he has a very inflated opinion of his own role in these things. One reason he was ignored was that he was such a self-promoter and such a narcissist. The fact was that there was still concern that Saddam Hussein, at the point where he could break free from UN sanctions, UN economic sanctions, and get rid of the international weapons inspectors, would return to the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and that he was prepared to provide them to terrorist groups.
Okay, fair enough. But my question was he ignored? He says Iraq had nothing to do with it. He says he's in the meetings. But my question is, when he made that claim in these meetings, in these conversations, was he ignored? And if not, what was the response to him?
Look, I don't know whether he made the claims or not. The decision to go after Saddam Hussein was not based on the 9/11 attack.
It was based on the belief that he had weapons of mass destruction, which ultimately turned out to be non-existent.
Well, I just explained to you what the basis of the belief was. It wasn't flawed intelligence, wasn't anybody that lied. It was that, other than Saddam Hussein, it was the claims he had made in 1991, 92, and 93 about his own chemical weapons.
Right. And again, in pursuing that thread, you had to ignore inspectors, weapons inspectors. You had to ignore advice from serious
simply
people.
Wrong about that. All they said was they couldn't find evidence of it. Well, the logical inference was that he was hiding it from them.
The logical inference, you think the logical inference of we did not find that Iraq possessed chemical or biological weapons or that it had reconstituted its nuclear weapons program is that he's hiding them? After 900 inspections at 500 sites, the inspectors say that they could not find that Iraq possessed chemical or biological weapons or that it had reconstituted a nuclear weapons program. They asked for more time. Other folks said similar things, that there was no evidence of it. And you're saying that the logical inference, that the reasonable person, the reasonable man or person would infer from that, not that there were no weapons or that the evidence was untrue or that the claim was untrue, but that Saddam Hussein is simply hiding it from an international community and professional inspectors on the ground. That's the logical inference?
Let me just remind you of the important intelligence adage. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There was no disproof of the notion that Saddam still had extensive chemical weapons stockpiles.
But those are all arguments for continued monitoring. Those aren't arguments for war. Those aren't arguments for military intervention, absence that evidence when people are asking for more time.
I think it's a perfectly good argument that we didn't want to wait until one of our cities was a smoking ruin.
Yeah,
Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
But that would suggest that there's some ticking time bomb that couldn't be averted otherwise.
Population. He was a threat to peace and security in the region. He had repeatedly violated Resolution 687. If you believe in the sanctity of Security Council resolutions, when a country repeatedly violates it, I would think that would concern you. So I have no trouble at all with the conclusion that Saddam was a threat and he should have been removed. In 2020 hindsight, we should have removed him in 1991.
John Bolton, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Glad to do it.